Hello, welcome everyone. You can now be seated. I wish we could see you and everything. Well, we do have a chat and we'll have a Q&A, an online discussion after our speakers are done. And we'd love to hear from all of you. So, we're really excited to talk about this subject and not have to leave our house to do it. So we'll try and finish up by around 8 or at the latest like 8:30 or so. My name's Drake Myers. I'm a member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee who's hosting in this discussion. I'd like to thank our co-host, Women Against Military Madness, as well as Climate Justice Committee and Minnesota Peace Action Coalition. Each of these orgs are doing important work in our community, so it's going to be great to hear from them all tonight. The Anti-War Committee doesn't endorse candidates, so anybody who endorses a candidate or seems to tonight is endorsing as an individual, not endorsing on behalf of the committee. And there's a ton of stuff to cover, so let's get started. So we all here agree that there's plenty of differences between Biden and Trump in terms of how they'd govern America, but it's a lot harder to tell the difference between their foreign policies. It matters little to Afghanis, for instance, whether it's Bush or Obama or Trump or Biden sending the troops in air raids to their long-occupied country. Imperialism remains a bipartisan commitment to a large degree, but what are the differences? What can we expect from the next 4 years? After all, as a movement, we've got to be ready to protest for an end to US imperialism no matter who is president. So I'll begin this talk just by kind of catching us up to date with the state of imperialism, and so we can understand the situation, what the next president is coming into. Trump has done a lot of posturing as anti-war, and sadly, some people have fallen for it in a big way. He talks the talk. He called out the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq on the campaign trail in a big way on the stage in his debates with other Republican primary contestants. During his presidency, he has doubled the number of troops in Afghanistan, so he hasn't really walked the walk at all on that. He also gave the Pentagon authorization to bomb anything, anytime, leading to more bombs dropped than ever before in that country, including the largest non-nuclear mother of all bombs in 2017, a weapon that was hatefully named after Islam's holiest site, Mecca, which people called the mother of all cities. So they called it the mother of all bombs. So far, 150,000 Afghanis have been murdered in our endless occupation. Trump presided over a 52% increase in civilian casualties since he's been president, an entire generation of children who have only known war. 2/3 of the surviving population have mental health problems as a result, and 90% of Afghans want a peace talk between the Taliban and the US as soon as possible. As the Pentagon Papers showed, both political parties have long known that there is no winning in Afghanistan, and the Pentagon can no longer even tell what winning would look like. Because of his supposed wild card nature and his constant posturing as anti-war, some are confused about Trump, but he's just the current CEO of Empire. Most Americans oppose war, so the snake oil salesman Trump just says he is anti-war and people want to believe it. Simple as that. Other times, when he wants to appeal to his more militant, hawkish base, he plays up xenophobia and supports torture, saying, I'm going to bomb the hell out of ISIS. I'm going to bomb the shit out of them, and talking about giving the generals full reign, removing all semblance of human rights obligations. He's increased military spending to $750 billion, arming militias all over the world. The reality is, our president has been talking out of both sides of his mouth the whole time. Obama sold a lot of arms, but Trump is the arms dealer in chief. He lifted restrictions on selling arms to human rights violators and even instructed the Pentagon and diplomats to become salesmen for private weapons contractors directly, which, by the way, is not actually supposed to be their job, right? Which is hard to remember after decades of our defense company Pentagon revolving door. But usually when they're on the Pentagon, when they're in the Pentagon, they are not actively salesmen for the private weapons contractors that hire them when they're done at the Pentagon. So under Trump, US companies have had hundreds of billions of dollars of overseas weapons sales. He's been pumping taxpayer cash into that war machine, tripling the stocks of Boeing and Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and emptying the public funds. He also spent billions on the creation of a space force, a full new 8th branch of the armed forces. Trump's gigantic $750 billion defense budget passed both the House and Senate nearly unanimously. That's nearly $100 billion more than is budgeted for transportation, education, veterans benefits, health, and housing assistance. When it comes to stuff like this, nearly every US politician agrees that it's more important to pay for wars and corporate welfare for the arms companies than it is for education. Even after the Pentagon admitted they could not account for nearly $6.5 trillion of what they've been given over the years. Trump may be a bit more flashy as a salesman, but he's just another puppet of the war machine, pretending to be a dove one minute and a hawk the next, creating a global climate of uncertainty and suffering and bringing us to the brink of wars on every continent. But how might Biden deal with inheriting a situation like that? A lot of top military and national security officials are actually excited that Biden is a more predictable and old-fashioned imperialist. And the Biden campaign is putting out ads where he's saying that he'll support the troops and how more national security advisors in general support him than Trump. These are not good endorsements. These are not endorsements to brag about. These are a signal of Biden cozying up to exactly the wrong people there in Washington. And we'll hear more about the Democratic platform for foreign policy that Biden is running on from the speakers tonight. And our first speaker is Tracy Molm, a longtime member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee, fighting US imperialism in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, of course, everywhere else. She's been a member of delegations to Venezuela last year, as well as Palestine in the past. And tonight she's here to talk about how the next president could affect the situation in Venezuela. So Tracy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Drake. And thank you everyone for watching tonight. As Drake said, I went on a delegation to Caracas, Venezuela at the end of April 2019. So a little over a year ago, and was able to join with 4 million Venezuelans in the streets on May Day of that year. So I kind of want to start with where we're at, right? Trump's policy towards Venezuela. In January of 2019, he announced the backing of Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. In fact, ignoring a democratically elected government and declaring Juan Guaido president of the country. Guaido was and still is unknown to the vast majority of Venezuelans. At the time, he represented like under 400,000 Venezuelans from the small state of Vargas, which is in the top section of the country, right along the ocean. This is in a country of 30 million people. It was much akin to when Senator Klobuchar declared that she wanted to run for president and the rest of the country had no idea who she was. That was the president that the person that Trump put in charge of Venezuela. He was a leader in the group, the Popular Will, the right-wing reactionary party within Venezuela that was known for burning Black Venezuelans because they believed that they were supporters of the socialist project or of the Maduro government. He didn't have the support of the Venezuelan people, but that didn't matter to Trump. While I was there, we witnessed a coup attempt by Guaido where he worked hand in glove with paramilitary forces from Colombia and released a known criminal, Leonardo Lopez, someone who was in jail and on house arrest at the time because his party had actively incited riots, killing Venezuelans in the streets, putting up razor wire across roads so that motorcyclists were decapitated. These are the people that Trump is supporting in Venezuela. During this coup attempt, there was they attempted to claim that they were taking over the country, and the U.S. news ran with it, right? They pretended like this was happening. At the time in Venezuela, though, only several thousand people came out to the streets to support him. The vice president of Venezuela, the Maduro government, like Maduro's vice president, called for patriotic Venezuelans to join them in the streets, to join them and defend the democratically elected government. And they showed up in the millions. We joined them in the streets that day, and they literally were there from 8 a.m. until dark to stand up for the government that they chose, the project of putting Venezuela for the Venezuelan people. Now, one of the other main things that Trump has done is to increase sanctions against Venezuela. And so it is, and then using those sanctions to create forced shortages, in particular shortages in things that would help be able to use oil and export oil. And so Venezuela is now in a serious economic crisis because of the sanctions. And then the Trump administration has used that to blame Venezuela for having an economic crisis. They have also ensured that no country around the globe can easily partner and work with Venezuela, either buying their oil or other goods, or to help Venezuela import goods that they need. And so, yeah, that is the state that Trump has supported in Venezuela. So we look at what happens in under a Biden administration, right? What does Biden say that he wants to do? Oh, he believes that the problem is not that Trump has backed the wrong horse, or that Trump has backed someone who is counter to what the Venezuelan people want. In fact, he believes that Trump's problem is that he hasn't made enough friends in making this happen. Now, initially, when Trump announced Guaido as the president, he tried to strong arm many countries into doing the same thing. And there were countries who lined up. And as time went on and it became clear that Guaido was not going to have any staying power, was never going to assume any of the roles of president, most of those countries flipped and went back and realized that they had made a poor choice. They couldn't will a president into being, but in fact, they would have to give up. But Biden believes what he needs to do is just work harder to get more friends in this policy. He believes that more countries need to be part of recognizing Juan Guaido. He also claims that he believes that we should be supporting the Venezuelan people while continuing with sanctions, something that makes zero sense. The sanctions are what is causing hardship in Venezuela. The sanctions are what is causing food shortages. The sanctions that target food programs like the CLAP that provide food to the poorest Venezuelans. In fact, 80% of the country gets boxes of food that they call the CLAP delivered to their doorstep. And that is what sanctions target in Venezuela. So Biden's rhetoric that he would support Venezuelans while continuing sanctions is disingenuous at best, a lie in reality. The other thing that Biden joins with most of people in Congress in calling Maduro a tyrant. A democratically elected government, he calls Maduro a tyrant. Now, sadly, this is most politicians have lined up with this same lock and step, including, the favorite of many, Bernie Sanders was on that same page in many ways. And the last thing that Biden really says is that we need that he would work to normalize relations with Cuba. And that is important in this case because Cuba is one of the few countries that, despite sanctions and blockades, has continued to work with the Venezuelan government, with the Maduro government. And Biden believes that he can pressure Cuba to stop. And that is actually something that would be very traumatic for the Venezuelan government. Under Biden, when Biden was president, he was part of the process in normalizing relations with Cuba, which was great for us here. Many people were able to visit Cuba, and 100% I believe that is something that we all want. But if it means a way to strong arm the Cuban government into not supporting the Maduro government, it's wrong, and it's something that we don't support. So the question is, where do we go from here? And I think, the reality is Biden or Trump, we will have to continue to fight for the Venezuelan people's chosen government, for the Maduro government that supports its people, that works hard to make sure that the government, that Venezuela is for the Venezuelan people and not for US corporations, in particular oil corporations. Biden has a much better record domestically, and I think it will create a much better atmosphere for us to be able to continue to fight for Venezuela. And so I believe that for the people of Venezuela, we must continue to stand up, no matter who's in charge. That this isn't over, and so we will need to be in the streets and continue to speak out for sovereignty and the right of the Venezuelan people to pick their own government, and to support the government that they have picked, the Maduro government. With that, I will pass it along. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy, for that strong message of solidarity with the people of Venezuela. Our next speaker is going to be Meredith Aby-Keirstead, a co-founder of the Anti-War Committee. She's led human rights delegations to Colombia, and in 2002 participated in a Palestine solidarity delegation, which traveled to the West Bank, Haifa, and Gaza. Meredith's focus tonight is on how the next president could steer U.S.-Israeli relations and how this will definitely affect Palestinians. So here's Meredith.
Thank you, Drake. What's interesting about this year's presidential election is that there have actually been times this presidential campaign where the question whether the U.S. should continue aid to Israel has actually been debated as an issue. Bernie Sanders said that the U.S. should leverage U.S. aid to Israel to win concessions for a broader peace settlement with Palestinians, and this is a first for the presidential campaign for a major party candidate. Historically, both parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans, have been united in unconditional support for Israel. However, with the Sanders campaign, the issue of whether or not the U.S. should continue to give $13 million a day in aid to Israel while it escalates its stealing of Palestinian land was actually put on the table. Additionally, Minnesota's own Representative Ilhan Omar helped take this conversation to the national level. The Anti-War Committee has been organizing against U.S. aid to Israel for almost 20 years, and we are excited that the Gallup poll reported in 2019 that U.S. support for Israel is at its lowest point in a decade, including among Republicans. The percentage of Democrats siding with Israel fell from 49% to 43% and approaches the lowest level of Democratic partiality towards Israel since 2005. So I know many people who've been doing this work for a long time in solidarity with Palestine feel like this is like the Sisyphean issue, but we haven't made real headway in this period. And so I think it's important not to give that up, even though there's not a person in this race who right now who we can point to who is from either major party that we can be like, yeah, that guy is going to really do it for Palestine. Neither of them can do that. But the fact of the matter is that we have an opportunity here in that more people are talking about our issue than have ever talked about it before. Okay. So to start with Trump has done a lot to tilt U.S. foreign policy in the favor of Israel, more than usual, which is saying a lot. His administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2017 and moved the U.S. embassy there, even though Palestinians see Jerusalem as the capital of their future state. He also cut off hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. aid to Palestinians and issued a so-called Middle East plan that was outright rejected by Palestinians because it so overtly favored Israel and because they weren't even allowed at the table. Like they weren't allowed to even give any input to this peace plan. You don't have to be an expert in international relations to be able to predict that a peace plan where one side wasn't even at the table is not going to work. It makes it look like it was political theater rather than actual diplomacy, which, is not surprising from the Trump administration. The Trump administration has also said that it no longer considers Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem illegal, which reverses decades of US policy. And then recently, the Trump administration presented this new peace deal where they persuaded the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to establish full diplomatic ties with Israel and are pushing other Arab nations to follow suit. These deals were denounced by Palestinians as grave betrayals by their fellow Arab states because it undermines their efforts for self-determination. Historically, there's been an Arab consensus that recognition of Israel will only come in return for an independent Palestinian state, which this peace deal clearly violates. The Trump administration on the campaign trail is trying to persuade the American people that it's a peacemaker. But in reality, how can it be a peace deal if the two sides weren't at war? Bahrain and Israel were not at war. The United Arab Emirates and Israel were not at war. Additionally, the point of the deal isn't to bring peace, but rather to make it harder for Palestinians to actually achieve statehood. That is not a peace plan. That is a land grab. Moving on to Biden. Well, Trump is clearly no friend of Palestine. It is important not to look at the Biden campaign with rose-colored glasses. On the campaign trail and in the Democratic primaries, Biden repeatedly states his support for Israel and makes it clear that he wouldn't be a departure from the Obama administration's support of Israel. Mondoweiss reports, quote, if Joe Biden is elected U.S. president, he won't improve U.S. policy for Palestinians. Nearly 70% of Palestinians say it will be the same or worse under Biden. Just 1 in 5 Palestinians says he will improve matters. So the Palestinian community understands that these are sort of, two parties that are offering a similar type of approach. Additionally, the Middle East Eye reports that, quote, Biden hailed the announcement that the United Arab Emirates and Israel had struck a deal to normalize relations as a historic step to bridge the deep divides of the Middle East. He even took partial credit for it, saying that it builds on the efforts of multiple administrations to foster broader Arab-Israeli opening, including the efforts of the Obama-Biden administration. So unfortunately, Biden's also not willing to even criticize the Trump administration's efforts to try to delegitimize Palestinians' efforts for working towards statehood. Biden's running mate, Senator Harris, doesn't offer us much hope on Palestine either. The Middle East Monitor reports that Senator Harris has been described as a staunch supporter of Israel and delivered a speech at AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, in 2017, not long after being sworn into the Senate. And when asked by the New York Times last year whether she thinks Israel meets international human rights standards, she replied, overall, yes. The Anti-War Committee strongly disagrees. We do not want further bloodshed on our hands, and we call for an immediate end to U.S. aid to Israel. We don't want to pay for home demolitions, for the arresting, torture, and imprisonment of children, or for the killing of protesters. When I was in Palestine in 2002, I saw how the Israeli military had dropped a bomb on an apartment building because they wanted to kill one person that they had deemed a terrorist. I would argue that everyone deserves a trial. But in addition to that target that they intended to kill, that person wasn't home. So they did not kill the person they intended to kill, but they instead leveled a multi-floor apartment building and killed 20 people, many of whom were children. Think about it. If an apartment building falls down and you have a big piece of concrete land on you and you're a smaller person, that's going to disproportionately hit your torso or your head, and it's going to kill you. So adults were more likely to survive that bombing than children, and that was devastating. I don't think that people should be killed for the crime of living in the wrong apartment building. So no, Senator Harris, Israel does not meet international human rights standards. Interestingly, the U.S.'s own State Department in 2019 published in its own human rights report that Israel's, quote, significant human rights issues included reports of unlawful or arbitrary killings, including targeted killings of Israeli civilians and soldiers, arbitrary detention, restrictions on non-Israelis residing in Jerusalem, including arbitrary and unlawful interference with privacy, home, and family, and significant restrictions on freedom of movement. So members of both parties ignore these findings and approve for our tax dollars to fund human rights attacks year after year. So regardless of who is elected in November, we have work that we have to continue. Before I conclude, I want to give a shout out to our friends who are in the Minnesota chapter of American Muslims for Palestine for their campaign to pressure Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison to not attend the 25-year memorial for Yitzhak Rabin, which is organized by Americans for Peace Now. Rabin was a war criminal who violently and brutally terrorized countless Palestinians, and their campaign that AMP is doing is educating Minnesotans on the brutality of Israeli occupation and on the doublespeak of members of the Democratic Party. And so we join with your calls for Ellison to cancel his commitment to that event. So in conclusion, regardless of whether or not we're talking about Trump, Biden, Ellison, Klobuchar, Smith, any leader, national, state, or local, we must continue to challenge the assumption that criticism of US support for Israel is anti-Semitic. We fundamentally have the right to criticize how our tax dollars are spent. We have the right to say that our tax dollars should be spent taking care of human needs, not to imprison Palestinian children, not to subsidize the Israeli military, which indiscriminately kills civilians, not to pay for home demolition, not to pay for land stealing from the indigenous people who have lived on it for so many generations. We need to call for the US Embassy to move out of Jerusalem, and most importantly, we need to echo the calls from Palestinians throughout the diaspora for the right to return of Palestinians. We need to be ready to continue our protests in the streets for a free Palestine, regardless of who's elected in November. The Anti-War Committee is ready to do so, and we hope you are too, because fundamentally, more people are starting to question the US's commitment to Israel than ever before, and we can't let up. This is not a time for us to have this movement cool off. This is a time where we need to keep pushing forward, and we need to join with the brave voices who've been doing that. But also, we are not alone. There are actually people, including Minnesota's Representative Ilhan Omar, who are actually doing this at a national level. And so we need to not be silent. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Meredith. And that is a great point, that we cannot afford to view this as a losing battle, that this is about winning. And you know, so many lives are at stake right now, especially during COVID, with sanctions against bringing in medical equipment. And it's a very dire situation, and public perception is changing quick. So this is a time to really fight to free Palestine. So our next speaker is going to be Autumn Lake, a member of the Anti-War Committee and the United National Anti-War Coalition's Youth Against Empire. Tonight, she'll be speaking on how the next president will influence US policy towards China. She recently spoke on this nationally for UNAC on the webinar a couple of days ago on the 17th. And that was really cool this weekend. So thanks for speaking about this issue again tonight, and I'll turn it over to you now, Autumn. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So the anti-war movement has had its hands full in the past decade with what seems like a constant cascade of foreign destabilization and regime change attempts, as well as as Meredith talked about, the constant expansion of the Israeli apartheid regime and the U.S. backing of such. But concurrent with all this, the United States has been building towards an entirely different and really unique sort of conflict. It's what the Pentagon calls a great power rivalry between the US and the People's Republic of China. So this so-called great power rivalry is actually akin to the Cold War that had existed between the United States and the Soviet Union once upon a time. The US in this process has destroyed any semblance of normal relations with the People's Republic of China in favor of escalating conflict, in favor of enacting economic sanctions, and in favor of engaging in military maneuvers. Engaging in military maneuvers that have the potential of turning this new Cold War into a hot one at a moment's notice. Now, while it would be convenient to kind of view this as an aberration of the current administration, the fact is that the US's escalation of threats against China is a bipartisan effort, as both the Democrats and the Republicans have their own particular policies and tactics on what is otherwise a unifying issue. In order to paint a complete picture of the circumstances that the anti-war movement faces with this new Cold War and the particularities of how the Democrats and Republicans will pursue this conflict, and of course, Trump and Biden themselves, it's important to understand like how this conflict came about in the first place. And it's easy to think of it as like something that's like fairly new because all this stuff about China has been really on the news a lot in the past like 2 or 3 years or so, right? But really, we can trace back all the way to 2012. In 2012, the Obama administration enacted its Pivot to East Asia, which is a foreign policy strategy that gradually restructured the US's focus away from destabilizing the Middle East and towards a strategy of military and economic containment of the People's Republic of China. This change in the Pentagon's strategy marks the transition from mere economic and political competition with China to outright conflict with China. In 2015, Robert Daley, the director of and I can't make this name up, the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, don't laugh, stated that even if China were to change, even if they were to adapt our constitution and our laws wholesale, we should still try to limit their growth purely because they are, I lost my place. I'm so sorry. Gosh darn computers. Purely because we shouldn't have a peer competitor. We must stop them, even if it means we have to push them back into poverty. That last line is particularly scary. Even if we have to push them back into poverty. See, China represents an alternative to the US-led imperial bloc's economic order. So this is because countries the world over, including much of Africa, much of the Middle East, and even some European powers like Italy, are finding economic and political relations with China to be a much more favorable arrangement than dealing with the United States and the IMF, World Bank, etc. This, of course, brings us to our current era of political struggle. With the upcoming election, we're now faced with two possibilities for how this conflict will be handled in the next 4 years. And in the case of a Trump presidency, well, the Trump administration has proven their intentions through the past few years of relations with China. In 2018, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other Trump administration's officials declared an end to business as usual with the People's Republic. To that end, the U.S. has since adopted a policy of encouraging turmoil in China. The Trump administration threw its weight behind the recent Hong Kong protests, which came in response to a proposed extradition treaty between Hong Kong, the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, and Macau. In 2018, a Hong Kong college student murdered his 20-year-old pregnant girlfriend while vacationing in Taiwan. Hong Kong law does not allow for his extradition. It would be like if we in the U.S., weren't able to extradite someone who had escaped to Hawaii after murdering their pregnant girlfriend because the federal court is located in California, other C location. Likewise, China didn't want this murderer to escape justice by being in a different place either. So these protests that erupted in response to this proposed extradition treaty, they had the veneer of a movement for justice, but their content was this pro-colonial and pro-imperialist nature. They often hailed Donald Trump and the former British Empire as arbiters of freedom and justice. I promise that's not a joke. The joke was earlier in the speech. Leaders of that movement regularly met with and had the support of notorious right-wing slime in the United States, including Senators Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. And they also received funding from the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. While we're speaking about, how the U.S. throws its weight around when it comes to China's domestic issues, the Trump administration also enjoys criticizing China for its treatment of the Muslim majority Uyghur ethnic group in Xinjiang. While let's be real, no country is above criticism, and claims of human rights violations should be taken seriously. But the US's own history of supporting marginal ethnic groups in an attempt to malign its current geopolitical targets worries us in the anti-war committee. See, there's a certain audacity to the Trump administration condemning China for concentration camps while maintaining its own true-to-life concentration camps. There's a certain audacity to the administration claiming to have the interests of Muslims in mind, despite having instituted the Muslim ban and having spearheaded the continued spread of anti-Muslim hate in the United States. You know, of course, we're interested in hearing about this issue from other Muslim majority countries in the region, you know, those who might be most closely affected by it. In the meantime, we in the AWC always ask ourselves, would any of what's going on justify US intervention? Frankly, that answer is no. A war with China does not benefit Muslims in China, and it does not benefit Muslims in the United States. We cannot accept Trump's framing of this issue, even as people who genuinely do worry about human rights. The Trump administration's framing of the COVID-19 crisis as the fault of China has directly caused the recent rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. In the months following the outbreak, Asian Americans faced more than 2,100 incidents reported across the country between March and June, including attacks with glass bottles, acid attacks, groups of people engaging in assault. Add to this the administration's characterization of Chinese tech companies as tendrils of the Chinese Communist Party, while US companies and government agencies continue to surveil people in the US and continue to use their personal data. And we've got this recipe for racist resentment and distrust of East Asians in the United States. See, prior to the campaign against Chinese tech companies, the Trump instigated trade war with China devastated agriculture and industry in the US, threatening jobs and resources. They didn't undermine the government of China like they said they were. They wound up hurting people living here, workers, just people trying to go about their days. With all this in mind, it becomes clear that the Trump administration doesn't have so-called human rights in mind when it escalates conflict with China. The supposed interests of Muslim majority ethnic groups, the interests of Muslim majority ethnic groups, the interests of people of China, none of these are actually truly represented in Trump's policies. It's all a facade to, it's all facade used to manufacture consent for the US's campaign to undermine another sovereign state. Now, I could criticize Trump all day because it is one of my favorite hobbies. And it's unlikely that I'll stop anytime soon. But I am going to shift gears a little bit because turns out there's another guy. It's actually really important to note that Joe Biden served as vice president to Barack Obama when the pivot to East Asia was first implemented. Based on the DNC's own platform, Biden's campaign rhetoric, and the previous actions of the Obama administration, a Biden administration may focus less on direct military posturing with other and open conflicts, and focus more on reestablishing and rebuilding alliances with other powers that remained opposed to China's growing economy. The DNC's own platform indicates that a Biden administration would pursue more diplomatic approaches to conflict with China over military actions. Now, unfortunately, these alternatives include economic sanctions and other forms of economic and political pressure. Combined with the potential for these anti-China alliances with other countries, the previously mentioned philosophy of containment may see more use under the Biden administration. However, it is likely that a Biden administration would focus far less on accusations of industrial espionage, trade wars, and racist accusations of China being the originator and propagator of the COVID-19 virus. The Democrats seem more likely to focus on the human rights element that the Trump administration has already touched on with regards to Hong Kong and Xinjiang, which still means U.S. interference in Chinese affairs and the potential to weaponize the same seemingly genuine concern for marginal groups in China in an attempt to undermine that sovereign state. Biden appears to represent a more even-tempered and strategic approach with China, but it is conflict with China nonetheless. While the Biden administration may be less eager to pull the trigger, they are by no means putting the gun away. And while there are differences between how Trump and Biden would handle the current conflict with China, it does remain clear that this new Cold War will remain the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy for the foreseeable future. The United States' primary campaign will be to unseat China as an economic power and to reassert itself as the center of the world economic and political order, even as the U.S. continues to commit regime change and enact sanctions in other parts of the world. We, as dedicated anti-imperialists, must oppose the U.S.'s efforts to return China to the dark days of colonial enslavement and dependency on Western capital. We must recognize that U.S.-backed war and regime change has never benefited marginal and vulnerable populations, not in Bolivia, not in Somalia, not in Afghanistan, and it certainly won't be the case if the U.S. continues to intervene in China. We must be prepared to resist the U.S. war machine as it threatens a country that had historically been in the crosshairs of various colonizers and imperialist pillagers of the world. We must say no to a new Cold War, regardless of who's in charge.
Thanks so much, Autumn. So our final speaker tonight is going to be Zach Moore from the Climate Justice Committee, here to speak about the tremendous impact of the U.S. military on our climate. With 800 military bases in 70 different countries, the devastation caused is really second to none by the U.S. military. In addition to being an awesome activist, super involved in a lot of Twin Cities organizing, Zach is a senior at South High. So thanks for agreeing to speak tonight, Zach, and especially about this issue that deceptively seems to kind of evade being connected to the anti-war movement, when those connections are clearly vital for us to understand and build both movements. So thank you so much, Zach, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks so much for everyone for joining in. So I'm here, like Drake said, I'm here representing the Climate Justice Committee. So we're a grassroots climate organization that was founded earlier this year. That in particular wants to direct the discussion on climate change to the demand for climate justice and the fight against the particularly polluting force of U.S. imperialism. Like Drake talked about, these issues are inextricably linked. And today I want to speak on, the fight against climate change and imperialism and its prospects given the upcoming election. So just to start off, it should be a surprise to few that Donald Trump is no friend of nature. The man is standing in the middle of a whirlwind of flame as hurricane after hurricane terrorizes the Gulf Coast and Caribbean Sea and continues to deny climate change even exists. What limited environmental regulations have been in place have often been ignored or repealed altogether by his administration. We can see already from Trump's current head of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler, who is most well known for his defense of marine energy and lobbying against environmental regulations, that this administration has doubled down on their fight against the environment and against the climate justice movement overall. And Trump's reaction to the fires that have raged through the West Coast have only more clarified this. When asked about California, his response was to comment about how the issue really is all the dried up leaves and how, well, entire forests and towns were burning. And that, in fact, the temperature would soon be cooling. I was personally quite shocked to hear that Trump was now a meteorologist, and I'm certain so were the actual meteorologists. His answer to increasing hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico has been truly disastrous as well. While Puerto Rico struggled under both colonial domination by the US and the lasting devastation of Hurricane Maria, Trump's answer was to throw paper towels into a crowd and try to cover up the number of deaths, not unlike his current PR scheme during this pandemic. His military strategies have only enhanced the sheer destruction that the US military, which the U.S. military is the 7th largest polluter out of everyone, including nations of the world, and it is the largest non-state polluter. Trump's military policies have exacerbated already existing mass pollution by the imperialist war machine. But make no mistake, simply because the Trump administration is anti-environmental justice and does not believe in climate change does not automatically make Biden pro-environmental justice or make him some sort of anti-war candidate, of which he, the past speakers have shown he is not. So let's examine some of Biden's campaign promises. The start of his website page that discusses his climate plan opens with this line: "Do you agree we need drastic action to address the climate emergency?" Following this line, his plan is outlined by the campaign as 1. A 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions by 2050. 2. Building a stronger nation, rally the world to fight climate change. 3. Stand up to polluters. And finally, 4. Supposedly supporting workers and communities as thanks for powering the Industrial Revolution. So first off, I'm a little surprised to learn that the word drastic has a dual meaning. This new one, I know it's new definitions. The dictionary should get on that. This new one meaning dull, vacillating, and too little, too late. So let us look a little deeper into these promises. 2050 is his goal. The year 2050, around a decade, even more than a decade actually, after every leading scientist and climate justice organizer has said is the jumping off point for climate change, where the warming of the planet has gone beyond 5 degrees. Not to mention, how can he ensure this by 2050 if he will not even be president? That's just the foul odor of an empty slogan. Next up, he wants to rally the rest of the world to fight climate change. U.S. imperialism has filled the sky with toxic smog from Syria to the Philippines, and Biden wants to speak of a US-led effort against climate change when he won't even discuss the military's leading effort in causing climate change. In fact, his plan appears to be driving on the prepping of the US military in order to enact resource wars, and speaks of how the US supposedly needs to prep its imperialist military bases, as Drake pointed out, over 100 worldwide, around the world to deal with ecological impacts on national security. Remember, this is the US military that is the 7th largest and largest non-state polluter in the world that he wishes to expand. And that's just another reason of countless why the generals endorsing him is not a good thing. Next, he tells us he will stand up to polluters. The Democratic National Committee already disproved that when it struck a section calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies from the DNC platform. Even his running mate, Kamala Harris, has declared her intention to continue government support for fracking. And in the end, we know Trump has to go, but we cannot give into any illusions about who Biden is or what he will do, meaning this is not an endorsement if the last paragraph did not make that clear. These promises that he's giving are piecemeal changes and much too little and much too late. He doesn't even discuss how the US military, being the 7th largest polluter, and how the US's warmongering drive across the world has driven so much of climate change. He even continues in his plan doing what the Trump administration has already done, either only in a new form. Trump says that climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese government. Biden claims that it's actually China's fault for climate change and that the US should force China to fix it, which is just, yeah. But we do have hope. After all, it is the people and not politicians and bureaucrats where the power truly lies. We have seen just this past year what the power of the people can do, though those in power in both parties might struggle desperately against it. We must not kindly ask Biden to turn left. We must drag him kicking and screaming if necessary, which I'm certain it will be. We cannot just demand small action from people by decades in the future. We must demand climate justice now, no matter who ends up in office. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. So now we're kicking off into the Q&A section. So my name is Dewey. I'm with the Climate Justice Committee. So Drake and I are going to be asking our panel a couple different questions. If anything comes up that you guys want to ask, feel free to just pop it into the Facebook chat. Drake, you want to go ahead and jump to the first question?
Yeah, definitely. So this is a question for Tracy. And so let's see. So what is the message from Venezuelans on how US activists can help and show solidarity with them there?
So one of the things that I was kind of shocked to find, Venezuelans don't see in the news regular Americans speaking out for Maduro and speaking out for the Venezuelan people's choices and for sovereignty. And going there meant just worlds to the people there to see that there were normal Americans that were standing up and speaking out. One of the things, I wore my shirt, I got this shirt from a gentleman at the presidential palace at Miraflores, because he had come out to support his government during a coup attempt that was created by the US government, by Trump. And so just seeing people standing up for Maduro and speaking out made a huge difference. In a prior visit from one of our friends in the anti-war committee, Sarah Martin, she actually was there while we were having a solidarity bannering and was able to meet with Maduro. And he was so impressed that like normal people are standing up for the people of Venezuela that he tweeted it out to his thousands of followers on Twitter. And so, speaking out when you can and standing up, the anti-war committee will continue to have call-in days when there are things that when we see something that we need to speak out for, join for those things, and to speak out makes a huge difference. Venezuelans are, they appreciate every time we stand up for them and stand up for solidarity and their sovereignty. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Several speakers talked about the impact of sanctions. So if anyone that talked a little bit about sanctions, how do sanctions impact day-to-day life of people that are living in those countries? Go for it, Meredith. You're on mute.
I can fix this. One of the things I didn't talk about in my speech was the fact that when people are making connections, analyzing like the Middle East and with Biden and Trump, actually one area of difference between them is actually Iran. And so I think that that's important to address, and we don't have a speaker who's just talking about Iran. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to in some Iran content. Trump has really like upped the pressure on Iran. And his main way of doing this is like, for example, we've seen in other situations, is by using sanctions in an effort to basically starve people. And it's been particularly brutal in Iran, even before the pandemic. But I want to just put out there, it is criminal to be imposing sanctions on a country during a global pandemic. Like there are tons of people who have died in Iran because they are not able to import basic healthcare supplies that they need in order to fight this pandemic. There should be no sanctions that deal with healthcare supplies on any country in the world. And I think that any person who dies in Iran from COVID-19, that's blood on our hands in the United States. Because not only do we not allow anyone to trade with them, but we are enforcing these sanctions and trying to prevent anyone else from trading with Iran. And like these are things that you need in order to survive. And so I think that what's important for people to understand is like earlier in the anti-war movement, like when I started being an activist, people frequently raised this idea that like sanctions were an alternative to war and that they were better and that they were diplomatic. And I think it's important for people to understand that we learned that lesson of that mistake during the war on Iraq. We killed more people from sanctions in Iraq. And when you kill someone from sanctions, you're killing people who are very old or very young, like people who are incredibly susceptible to disease in a way that like people in the middle of their life are not. So we killed senior citizens and babies, to be quite honest, in Iraq. And we killed more people in Iraq than we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And like those deaths were ugly. Like mothers in Iraq had to watch their children die from preventable things because we wouldn't allow things, to come in, because we said that anything could be used for biological warfare or chemical warfare. We wouldn't even let Iraq get in pencils because we said the lead could be used in some sort of weapon, and so children were literally doing their lessons in the dirt in Iraq. And, I think that is really important for people to understand. So we've learned as an anti-war movement that sanctions are basically a political way to make it sound nicer that you're killing people, but it's actually a very brutal, slow, horrible way to die. The UN said that 567,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5 died from sanctions. We killed a lot more than that, but that's just an example of just like in that one demographic, children under 5. The anti-war committee started during the war in Iraq. It's the issue that sort of created our committee. And so we were created out of doing work against sanctions. And so we, as a committee, find it to be incredibly important for us to always try to help people understand that sanctions are an act of warfare. They're not actually a diplomatic tool.
Sanctions are proving to be a very unique question when it comes to U.S. relation with China, because normally, like as Meredith has stated, sanctions are primarily used as a means of, political pressure by means of starvation, by means of, denial of resources, etc. In the case of China, they actually just a few days ago, it was reported that they are now the largest economy in the world. They surpassed the United States. So it's in this case, it's less about denying the people of China resources. Rather, an effect sanctions have is it makes certain countries to be like undesirable trading partners, right? The consequences imposed on those who engage in trade and political relations with sanctioned individuals and sanctioned countries are pretty strong. So a risk. So like with China, like part of the goal is if you can make them an undesirable partner to trade to politically and economically associate with, that makes the United States more appealing. And as I stated earlier, a lot of countries all over the world are finding political and economic relations with China to be the more desirable option than political and economic relations with the United States. So in the case of China, it's again part of the process of trying to unseat them as the premier political and economic power in favor of the United States.
So if no one else has anything to add on that sanctions point, the next question would be for Meredith. What changed to shift the national political conversation around Israel and Palestine? We've seen that shift, but what changed and what's worked to make that huge headway?
I think that I'm good. I'm still unmuted. I didn't make the same mistake again. It's important to always make new mistakes. So I think there are a couple of things that really sort of were catalysts for sort of changing the conversation around the US's unquestioning support for Israel. One is that if people remember back to the flotilla, so there were like humanitarian supplies that people from all sorts of international countries were bringing to Palestine. Because again, this is like the sanctions we're talking about. People in Gaza were not able to rebuild after Israeli bombing. And so they couldn't build their houses. People didn't have clean water. People didn't have access to healthcare. And like the Israelis wouldn't let anybody in. And so the international community basically loaded up these ships, and they had civilians on them from a whole bunch of different countries, but including the United States, and people were sending them to Palestine to go and give people humanitarian relief. Well, Israel sent commandos to the ship, and they took over the ship, and they actually killed people who weren't Palestinian. But the deal is that this time, the people that were killed were not Palestinian. This time, the people that were killed were from a variety of different European countries. And people were outraged. They were like, you can't just kill our citizens because they're in international waters and you don't want them to be there. Like, that's not a civilized way that people deal with people. And Israel's just sort of like, whatever, you can't interact with the Palestinians. This is what we do. Anyone who tries to interact with Palestinians is a terrorist. And so people were just like, what? And so in part, there was like this political consciousness that happened, starting with the flotilla, where people are like, wait a minute, you shouldn't just murder them in cold blood. And so that really sort of started this conversation where people were like, and that's where you started, like Gallup, when you look at Gallup polls for like when all of a sudden public opinion started to change and drop for unconditional support for Palestine, that's where it happens. Okay. Another sort of like, turning point that you could look at would be when you've got things like the election of Ilhan Omar, but also when you've got people like Betty McCollum, who represents St. Paul. One of the major pieces of foreign policy legislation that Betty McCollum has authored and championed is saying that the U.S. should not be supporting Israel if they're going to imprison Palestinian children. She's not talking about the home demolitions, which I think would be great if she did. She's not talking about the shooting of civilians at protests, which I think would be great if she did. Like, she's literally focusing her bills on this little tiny issue. You shouldn't imprison children, which I actually think should be like a real consensus builder. But the fact is that now there's like this moment where you could do something and like raise these issues in Congress and get reelected. Like the fact that like Betty McCollum is going to win a reelection, the fact that Ilhan Omar won her reelection, is going to win her reelection and won the primary, when one of the main reasons why people were funding her opposition candidate was because she was supporting Palestine and she dared to say things like free Palestine, or the fact that Rashida Tlaib, she's going to win her reelection campaign in Detroit. And, again, before, what happened is if you were someone who actually dared to question the US's support for Israel, AIPAC and groups like that would put a ton of money into your campaign, into your opposition campaign, and kick you out of Congress. We saw that happen repeatedly, but that has changed. And so there have been a couple of things that have really made it, that have opened up this political space. And then, as I said in my speech, the fact that we have people like Bernie Sanders questioning in the presidential debates whether or not we should have uncritical support for Israel. Now, I think it's important to recognize that just didn't happen, spontaneously. I mean, like 4 years before that, we had people on the floor of the Democratic National Convention, raising the Palestinian flags, trying to like get actual things added to the Democratic platform, getting shut down, being told to shut up. But there has been an actual debate and discussion within the Democratic Party, and that's huge. But it's important to see that this is a long time coming. And sometimes people really want these changes to happen quickly, and God, that'd be great. But the thing is that if there's one thing I've learned from the Palestinian people is that you can't give up just because winning takes a long time, and they've been fighting for decades. And I think it's important to recognize that we've made a lot of progress, but we're not done.
Awesome. Thank you, Meredith. So this next question's open up to anyone that wants to jump in. So we've talked a lot about foreign policy, and a lot of these issues have really big impacts on our day-to-day work here in Minneapolis. So what are the kind of the direct connections between what we're talking about right now and the things that are going on with Indigenous issues in Minnesota, Black Lives Matter, immigration, or anything else? You want to go for it, Autumn?
I'll give it an honest shot here. So one thing I talked about earlier, because there are multiple dimensions to this, one thing I talked about earlier is that the U.S.'s, campaign against China has the apparent side effect of engendering anti-China, anti-Asian racism in the United States. A huge part of that can be seen just from the polls conducted on whether or not people approve of China. Like prior to the initiation of the pivot to East Asia, it was roughly 47% of Americans had a negative view of China. Right about now, that number has increased to 73%. And of course, knowing how racism manifests, how hate spreads, how it propagates, this this anti-China sentiment has spilled over to several East Asian groups. There was a Japanese man who was attacked in New York a couple weeks ago by a group of 8 people, just violently physically assaulted. There was a woman that was attacked with acid. There was so many instances of violence against East Asian folks living in the United States. I think another way this kind of relates to the movements domestically, right, is I did talk about the Hong Kong protests, which have a weird dimension to them in that they are a pro-Trump, pro-old British Empire, like odd movement. But a lot of people who are out in the streets every day here in the United States fighting for peace and justice, fighting in the movement for Black lives, in movement for indigenous sovereignty, when they see people in other countries, staging protests, resisting this the state they're living in, the first instinct is to be like, oh, we're doing the same thing. You're my, sibling movement in another country. And leaders of the Hong Kong movement, who again ally themselves with like the Marco Rubios, who are not pro BLM, they're not pro indigenous sovereignty. People like Ted Cruz, who are not pro BLM, they're not pro indigenous sovereignty. Take 2. So in that sense, because we know that like that movement is questionable, and for the leaders of the movement to like kind of give off the impression of international solidarity when their practice is counter to that is really dangerous. So I think it behooves us as international solidarity activists to try to make this information more known, especially because like some people seek to incorporate some of those ideas and tactics into activism in the United States, which again is different movement under entirely different conditions for different people. That's all I've got for now, because I know if I keep going, I will go on forever.
I'd love to jump in. One connection that I see is that even though there might not be differences in terms of or strong differences between how Biden and Trump would manifest their foreign policy, the way that the language that they use about it has a different impact at home. For example, I know it doesn't matter to people abroad whether or not they have bombs dropped on them that are Democratic bombs or Republican bombs, and that is true. But when Obama went and visited a city, hate crimes against Muslim people did not spike. And we see that there have been actual studies done, that there's a rise in hate crimes that happen in a community after the president has a rally, which makes sense because if you listen to the things that the president says, when he comes to Minnesota, he says things that are incredibly disparaging about the entire Somali community. He leads chants like lock her up and send her home. Like he's honestly talking about deporting a U.S. member of Congress to Somalia when she's a U.S. citizen. Like these are not ways that like you normally engage and talk about like your political opponents. And so it is so I do think that even though there's some similarities in terms of like what their foreign policy is, the racist language that the president uses to talk about people that he disagrees with and the way that he talks about other countries is really negative. Like he calls developing countries shithole countries. Like he talks about foreign countries that way. And if you are a kid who is Salvadoran, who's living in the United States and here's what the US is talking about, your community, your family, your home country is a shithole country, that has that has really negative connotations for you, but also that's giving really horrible messages to like your classmates for like how they can talk to you. And I just think that's an important sort of manifestation of how the presidents, like the tone that they take does affect things domestically. And then the other way that I think you can make this tie in is that, you know, the fight for Black lives, the fight for Indigenous lives that are happening here in the Twin Cities and around the country, I think it's important to understand that the consequence of like these wars on terror is that there is a lot of military hardware that is being given to local police departments afterwards. And then if you've got all of that military equipment, you feel like you should go use it. And we've seen that at home. Like we've had the National Guard called out multiple times in the past 4 months in the state of Minnesota. We've seen that military hardware. We also saw it in 2008 at the Republican National Convention. And I think it's really important that we understand that when we are militarizing US forces to go fight and occupy other countries abroad, that those things come back home to roost. And we are seeing the effect of that. So I think there's a direct relationship between how the US occupies other countries and how this affects our own movements for justice at home.
Okay, so I think the next question would be for Autumn. Is there a connection between U.S. foreign policy targeting China and China's Belt and Road Initiative, which maybe you could also describe?
You know, I'm actually really excited that I got this question. So for those who don't know, the Belt and Road Initiative is a initiative started by China in 2013, basically to encourage international trade infrastructure, both by land and by sea. It includes, you know, obviously like the diplomatic and political infrastructure of like establishing trade agreements with other countries, but also like physical infrastructure, railroads, maritime routes, etc. So it is an initiative that like allows for more seamless and easy resource transportation between all the countries involved. And at this moment, there are roughly 70 countries signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative in one capacity or another. Now, this Belt and Road Initiative does play a major role in why the U.S. is opposed to China's current political and economic development. For one thing, you know, areas that the U.S. and the EU is actually a very important player in this as well. Both the U.S. and EU, areas that they've historically colonized or have occupied, you know, even after they've been kicked out by independence movements, they still maintain some sort level of economic dependence on those. Rather, they get those countries to maintain some level of economic dependence on this imperial bloc of countries, right? China's Belt and Road Initiative is something that offers an alternative to United States, the UK, to France. One that again is considered more desirable than relations with the U.S., UK, France, Germany. It's actually become so appealing that a large chunk of Eastern Europe has signed on as well. These are areas that are considered critical in U.S. foreign policy due to their proximity to Russia as well. So the U.S. and the EU and the UK really see this as like a dramatic risk in terms of their own foreign policy, in terms of maintaining the economic dominance of the imperial bloc. Furthermore, Italy has signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. Italy, one of the major players of the EU, has instead sided with China in economic and trade affairs through the Belt and Road Initiative. This dramatically weakens the EU's position as a premier economic power, and thus weakens the United States. For as far as U.S. strategy for maintaining economic and political hegemony, the Belt and Road Initiative is a effing nightmare. But it goes further than that. A lot of the physical infrastructure for the Belt and Road Initiative happens to run through Xinjiang, the area that the United States is focused on for supposedly for human rights reasons. But when you look at, as I mentioned previously, how the US likes to utilize concern for marginal groups to actually instead undermine sovereign states, the fact that the Belt and Road infrastructure goes through this region and helps to cement China's newfound economic power can't be ignored. That's something the United States has definitely taken into account. That's something that maybe not Donald Trump, but Mike Pompeo has definitely taken it into account. That's all I've got to say about that for now.
Awesome. Thanks, Autumn. So these next questions are from the Facebook chat for Zach. So does the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force have anything to say about any of the issues that you mentioned? And then how does this tie in with militarism against the environment and the environmental impact of the U.S. wars and bases all over the country?
Sure. So I have right here, the task force released a 110-page document of recommendations, and in all of those 110 pages, they couldn't fit in any recommendations about cutting U.S. military pollution or imperialist endeavors in other countries or getting rid of any military bases or anything. There's nothing in there about any of that. Like, overall, what's been talked about here, there is nothing about, like, the only thing that is marginally talked about is like a marginal discussion on native sovereignty, and it's not really, there's still not much there. And the only thing that's really in their press release is some talk about carbon-free infrastructure development and that kind of stuff. And the only thing they added that wasn't in Biden's Biden's plan that's on his website, that if I recall correctly, was on their what's the word when they advisory, they were advised on it, is the like carbon-free infrastructure buildings by 2035 was the only thing really that they added. That Biden, there was nothing like really on there about anything that wasn't about infrastructure when it came to climate change, and there wasn't anything about imperialist foreign policy. And generally that just, I think, when the US military is the 7th largest polluter in the world and is the largest non-state polluter, that really just undercuts any sort of, climate justice advances, because part of it is like, when we're discussing like the way like, oh, there's a lot of pollution. Well, part of the pollution is the wars, endless smog up from Syria and Iraq when the US went and is still there, It's like it's people there are subject to it. People the world over are subject to the the polluting brutalities of U.S. imperialist policy, and it's really, on the whole, any efforts to combat climate change without actually fighting one of the largest polluters and one of the like the US has 800 military bases, and those account for a ginormous amount of carbon footprint and a ginormous amount of environmental degradation. Oftentimes those bases are also like really closely linked to oil fields and oil projects often undertaken by US oil corporations. So like that's part of their whole purpose of being there, is damaging the environment. So it's really like any any refusal to talk about these things really just undercuts any discussion on climate change, really. Yeah, that's.
Thanks a lot for that, Zach. And so for the last question, it's a pretty general question and a good time to plug upcoming actions as we end tonight's discussion. So the final question is, what are things we can do in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, right? No matter who ends up being president. So anyone with any immediate answers to that? Tracy, yeah.
Well, I think people should know Bolivia just had an election, and the U.S. tried to commit, basically helped a coup happen in Bolivia, and the people rose up and voted those. Well, I'm going to use a bad word. I'm going to try not to. Voted the bad people out, and we should celebrate that and lift it up, right? And the Venezuelan people continue to support their government that Trump and Biden are going to try and attack. And so people should be ready to stand up against those things, right? In whatever form. And so long live the Mas Party. And so one thing that we can do is celebrate that and publicize it, right? The people of Bolivia have stood up against U.S. imperialism and against the efforts of the Trump to go after that. And I look forward to the Venezuelan people continuing to do the same.
Thanks. Now, Meredith, yeah.
I'm hoping that someone can talk about November 4th after I talk about October 31st. So MIRAC, the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, is organizing a protest, which the Anti-War Committee and the Climate Justice Committee are both endorsers of. And I know that the Climate Justice Committee is organizing a contingent for this protest. And so it'd be great if you could join us. So on Halloween, which is Saturday, October 31st, for those of you who don't understand this major important holiday, at noon, we are going to be gathering at Lake and Lagoon in Uptown. And the idea for the protest is that we want to encourage people to wear their best Halloween costume, but we want to have a march of witches, devils, zombies, superheroes, and more. And it says that we're going to conjure and unite forces from all dimensions and worlds to bring an end to the horror show we've been living under and usher in a new era. And so the idea is to talk about sort of what Trump has done. And I know that MIRAC has done some great job of making some paper mache and some new banners for this. But the idea is that if you've been paying attention to the news, some really horrible things have been happening on the US border to immigrant women. And so MIRAC is obviously going to be, focusing on that aspect of it. But the idea is that all different movements are going to be coming together to really talk about what the past 4 years of Trump have meant. And so we think it's going to be a great opportunity for people to get together, to learn about other people's actions. Of course, we want people to wear masks that actually aren't just scary, but actually also cover your nose and mouth so you can't spread COVID. And and there's lots of fun ways to make your mask Halloween appropriate. But that's definitely one action. And then I'm hoping somebody else can talk about November 4th, because that's going to be the next protest.
Yeah, so on November 4th, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression has a nationwide call for everyone coming out the day after the election to protest the last 4 years of how terrible it's been and the impact of COVID on our communities. So this is a huge nationwide push all across the country to really get people out there on the streets and show that the strength of our movement, and that's just not going to end as soon as the election's over. That's really a lot of the symbology behind putting it the day after the election. It's going to show that our strength as a movement isn't just about putting about a ballot box. It's about what we can keep doing going forward.
And the CJC is also going to be there with the contingent. So if people want to march with the Climate Justice Committee, they can. The Anti-War Committee meets regularly on Wednesdays, so we haven't decided whether or not we're organizing something for that, but the Anti-War Committee will definitely be there too. And so we would love to have our supporters join us for those two important actions. And then obviously after this country figures out who's going to be the president, the Anti-War Committee will be able to take our next steps in terms of putting forth our next campaign.
So, as far as what people can do to help this whole struggle move forward, right? We've already talked about great events you can come out to. Additionally, there are always groups taking the streets. So we've covered taking the streets. If you can't take to the streets, you can share our events, you can share our flyers, you can share the informational posts we put out. Not just the Anti-War Committee, but also the Climate Justice Committee. There are, if anti-war work is not the thing that speaks to you as a person, which would be weird if you're watching this, but that's fine. If anti-war work specifically doesn't speak to you, there are also other areas of work that relate to foreign policy in a big way. The immigrant justice struggle, for example, with groups like the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, is a big one, of course, because a lot of the migrants coming from various countries flee as a result of U.S. intervention in those countries. A notable recent example, of course, it was the caravan from Honduras a while back. That was a direct result of U.S. intervention in Honduras, which unseated their democratically elected leader. And also the movement for the movement for Black Lives Against Police Terror also connects with foreign policy as well. Many police officers are trained in the same tactics as the occupiers, the Israeli occupiers in Palestine. A lot of those same tactics are used. There's still these programs that allow old Department of Defense equipment to be used by domestic police departments, and we've seen those out in the streets when we've been, engaged in the protests against the killing of George Floyd. The foreign policy and U.S. intervention is like a big, all-encompassing issue. So if you're not hanging out with us, there's still a lot you can do to combat these issues. I still think you should hang out with us, though. I really do. Not that other groups aren't cool or anything, just, they don't have me. And I think I'm okay. That's all I have to say on that one.
You're okay. You're more than okay, right? But thank you so much. And I think with that, we'll end tonight's discussion. And thanks for watching. It'll be posted up on the Facebook page for later, so you can share it around. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.